circumstances to exist? Like, should it begin at a certain point in time, say when maybe rationality is favored over irrationality? Or would it be dangerous if your Bitcoin were adopted, say, under a totalitarian regime? Because then that way, the regime could dictate the truth, the original truth.
Well, the
Kind of a messy
regime
question.
can't dictate the truth. That's the problem.
Mm,
The regime can sort of try and promote certain things and can punish people for having different views.
yeah.
But with Bitcoin, well, we weren't always at war with Eurasia, because someone can sit there and go, but last week we weren't. And the regime can sit there and go, but we were. And you'll go, but it says so here that we weren't.
Mm-hmm.
So Bitcoin isn't something that a totalitarian government would ever put up with. The truth is, if we're in a totalitarian system, they would destroy it. They would never let it exist.
Now, in 1984, the continuous switching of sides in the Eurasia East Asia conflict, that was done by the party as a kind of a flex to we call it gaslighting these days, where they know that people know it's not the truth, but what they're doing is they're forcing you to accept that this is the consensus reality now, and that you need to fall in line with it, whether you think that or not. That's what they mean by doublethink. You're holding to.
Well, it was actually deeper than that.
Yeah, go on.
So if you think about the concept of doublespeak, what you're really looking at is a system where even people talking to each other wouldn't truly know what's being said. If the language constantly changes and you keep altering the meaning of words, then it becomes difficult for two people to truly understand anything other than the really basic communications that they need to do their job.
Yeah.
So this was part of what was being discussed by Orwell. And we have that now, where we want people to have a more fluid version of language. We want them to include ghetto language and other such things. Now, ghetto language isn't new, but that doesn't make it language. You don't want to make that part of your dictionary. You don't want to have it as how people learn. What we want to be able to do is use books for what they are, a form of telepathy that allows us to see the thoughts and communications of people from thousands of years ago. We don't want the Tower of Babel. We don't want to have to translate everything that every generation says to another generation. We don't want different blocks in New York not to be able to communicate because they have different dialects.
It's
And that's what you need to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a mishmash of cultures, and each culture carrying its own truth with it. And getting back to Bitcoin again, how does Bitcoin fix that? And I'm talking about the Bitcoin that processes your big data, not the payments layer one.
Well, Bitcoin doesn't. People do.
Mm-hmm.
But Bitcoin is a tool that allows us to have a system that we can build an immutable sort of record system on. And whilst that doesn't give us 100% truth, it gives us an indication of where lies have occurred and the ability to track over time any errors and to find those and record that as well. So Bitcoin creates a immutable log system that allows us to demonstrate all the changes that occur in society. That doesn't mean that we'll know everything. I mean, the perfect example is the Harry Sheldon series by Asimov, the Foundation series.
Yeah.
In that, 10,000 years in the future, we have all of recorded history. And Harry Sheldon was a historiographer who went through historical records and mined history. So you can imagine how much information is produced now. Imagine if everything was recorded forever. Imagine what that would be in 10,000 years' time. So even with these giant computers, try and imagine just the history of average people 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought experiment too, because I wonder what the world would be like today if we'd had a blockchain record you know since the days of Sumeria or something like that. Just what sort of information could be recorded there? What from history have we got
that's
wrong?
the interesting thing. Even now we have sort of records of history, and if you go through and analyze those, and then you look at a cursory low-level history that people propagate, they're different. So, I've been studying a lot of early American history as part of my political science degree. I'm just finishing in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And the history of the US prior to 1776 is very different at a postgraduate level than it is from an undergraduate or school level.
How so? You mean the actual events themselves, or the?
So you look at the history. You can look at a very cursory level of what occurred, and there's a lot of mythology in what we teach people. But when you study a lot deeper and you go into source materials from 200 years ago and compare those to the history textbooks, you can find a lot of differences. So as an example, I've been reading biographies and autobiographies of people like Jefferson and Washington, sourced records of some of the political decisions that were made, records of like the war in Tripoli and the Barbary Coast in the early 19th century, the foundation of places like Georgia and Louisiana, and the history in the records that you find and the history that are told in textbooks, they have an overlap and a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences as well. People clean up history and remove bits they don't like.
Exactly, yes. And we see many examples of that every day. We also see that in historical figures too. Historical events, historical figures. What we're seeing is the narrative that survived. We're not really getting the debate on that issue from back then. We hear that Caligula was insane and made his horse a senator, whereas that's probably not what happened.
I very much doubt that actually happened, but what you get is something like the works of Lucianus, who was a satirical poet, and then we look at the satirical poet who is probably equivalent to Saturday Night Live. And in the early days of analysis, when some of these things were written, we didn't have a lot of material translated or found. We found a lot more in the last 100 years and even the last 20. And the analysis of this work takes time and effort, and sometimes it's translated incorrectly, and sometimes people take it out of context. So a thought experiment would be, imagine 10,000 years in the future, someone decides to do a historiographic and primary source study of the 21st century, and they do it, and they found this excellent material. They found Oprah, and they've found Saturday Night Live, and a whole lot of other things, and maybe even Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, and they can tell us all about society in the 21st century.
Yep. Well, in a way, they do tell us a lot about society in the 21st century. Maybe that's what they should be studying.
A little bit of society.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And also when we look at history, we're looking at significant events. We're not really studying the mundane daily lives of the citizenry or the working people or anything like that. It's mainly important people because they were the only ones who had their histories recorded. In that way, social media may not be such a bad thing if it survives, because then you can get
Well, that's actually not correct.
really.
I mean, although at your junior level or high school level, you read about the kings, the queens, the emperors, etc.
Mm-hmm.
When, like at the moment, in my Japanese and Chinese history studies, what I did at Harvard, or the archaeology, for my recent, I presented a paper on archaeological studies of interactions between Chinese emissaries, the Parthian Empire, and then Rome and the Indo-Roman trade corridor after Trajan recently. And although that is at the time of certain emperors, and the actions of emperors changed the lives of people, all of what I was studying was merchants and trade, and how that sort of changed the lives of normal people who were trading, setting up colonies, interacting with other merchants, etc.
Mm-hmm. So you do find out a little bit about basic lifestyles and a general view of how people lived. You're not really hearing many individual opinions or thoughts or that kind of thing. I mean, I've never studied history in that detail. I do confess. I just found, it was a matter of what was available, and there's always a lot more available on the important, spectacular events rather than mundane ones.
So, yeah, of course, being me in the office here, the problem is, if you want to go into this, not everything's well and truly translated. So, if you don't mind Latin and Greek, there's a lot out there. So, Lucian, fortunately, is fairly much mostly translated fairly well, but a lot of the other works aren't, and that even includes medieval studies. So one of the recent exercises I've been doing with University of Birmingham, is translation of English medieval vernacular documents.
Right. As you do.
And most of these are normal, everyday type things.
Okay.
They're not the peasants out there, so to speak, but they're people who have like a manor house, or are engaging in parishes, and it may not be, it's middle class in a way.
Right. Yeah, and I guess in a way that's the kind of history we're recording now. It would be mainly middle class history, because people who are working all day.
But what I'm saying is, it's actually out there. But I mean,
yeah.
But it's out there. But people have to take an interest.
Mm-hmm.
So there are literally, and I'm not exaggerating, millions of untranslated documents, just in the British libraries here, from about the 8th century till 15th century, that are not translated or not explored or not investigated, because they are not anything to do with the main events in history. They're average people. They're parish records. They're records of people getting married or writing about problems with their husband or things like this. And I mean, the interesting thing is, history is changing. The last 20 years have seen us move more away from the big events into the events of the average person.
I agree.
And I think that's an exciting change in historical studies.
Yeah, which is why I find it quite troubling to see information actually being removed from the internet. Whether it's a Facebook group being deleted, or a Twitter account being deleted, or something like that, you're losing a lot of important knowledge that could be world changing at some point in the future. I mean, suppose Bitcoin does become